I had been traveling for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, when I arrived at the dilapidated motel on the outskirts of town. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement, and the neon sign flickered erratically, like it was about to give up on life itself. The air smelled of stale rain and diesel. As I approached the reception, the door creaked open with a hollow echo, revealing a sleepy clerk who barely looked up as I handed over my ID. His face was gaunt, his eyes vacant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been sitting behind that desk for far too long. The motel, with its peeling paint and broken lights, felt forgotten by time. Yet, something about it drew me in, like a moth to a flame. Room 7. The number was scratched onto the keycard with an almost frantic urgency. The walk to my room was brief, but each step made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched, like there was something just beyond the corner of my vision, lurking. When I finally reached the door, it creaked open without resistance, revealing a room that seemed as worn and tired as the rest of the motel. The room was nothing special: cheap carpet, a faint stain on the bedspread, and a nightstand with a few dust-covered books. It felt like the kind of place where people stopped only to escape something, or to avoid it. There was a strange stillness to the room, an unnatural quiet, as though time itself had come to a halt. After a long day on the road, I dropped my bag onto the bed and sank into the thin mattress, hoping for at least a few hours of sleep. But my mind wouldn't quiet. My thoughts kept racing, and so, in a moment of restlessness, I began to sift through the drawers of the nightstand beside me. I didn't expect to find anything of significance, but there, beneath a stack of old postcards, was something that immediately caught my attention: a small, weathered ledger. Its cover was made of dark, cracked leather, and the edges were frayed with age. It seemed oddly out of place in this mundane room. At first, I didn't think much of it. It looked like the kind of thing a previous guest had left behind, maybe a travel journal or an old notebook. But as I opened the pages, a shiver ran down my spine. The book was filled with names, hundreds of them, all written in thick, slanted handwriting. Next to each name was a date, followed by a chilling description of how each person had died. The entries started innocuously enough. John Harper, May 4, 1993, heart failure. Lucille White, September 12, 2001, car accident. Some were even stranger: Stephen Parker, August 17, 1987, strangled with a silk scarf. Amanda Black, March 22, 2009, eaten by wild dogs. The causes of death were graphic, bizarre, and unsettling. The deeper I went, the more disturbed I became. The names and dates felt strangely familiar, as though I had heard them before, or perhaps dreamed of them. Each death seemed more grotesque than the last. I flipped through the pages rapidly, my curiosity piqued but my unease growing by the second. But then I reached the bottom of the list. At the very bottom, where the last name should have been, there was one final entry. My name. My pulse quickened. I blinked, thinking it was some mistake, some bizarre coincidence. But no, there it was, written in dark, wet ink. The name I had been given at birth. The name my parents had called me for years. And beneath it, the cause of death, burned alive. A cold dread spread through me. My breath became shallow. How was this possible? This book, this ledger, had only been placed here recently. I had seen no one in the hallway. No one had come in or out of my room. The ink was still wet. Whoever had written this was still close by. I dropped the ledger as if it had burned me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stood frozen, my legs trembling. The air around me began to feel heavier, warmer. I thought I was imagining it at first, but then it hit me, the smell of smoke. The faintest scent at first, but growing stronger. The odor of burning wood, something acrid, metallic. The smoke was thick, curling through the air like a living thing. My gaze snapped to the walls. They were starting to change. The paint on the walls began to blister and crack, turning black in places, while a strange heat radiated from them. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady as my mind raced. The walls were burning. I ran to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. I pulled again, harder this time, but the door remained locked, as if mocking my desperation. The heat was unbearable now, almost suffocating. I could feel the air growing thicker, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The smoke seemed to be coming from everywhere, creeping along the floor, the ceiling, curling around my legs, my arms. The temperature soared. I turned back to the room, searching for any way out, but there was none. The windows were sealed tight, the curtains flickering with heat. And then, it happened. The walls, once a dull beige, were now fully blackened, the paint bubbling like molten lava. Flames sprouted from the cracks, snaking along the edges of the room. I was trapped. A scream tore itself from my throat, and I backed into the corner, hoping for a miracle, but the fire was closing in, relentless. The smoke burned my eyes, my lungs, and I could feel the heat creeping toward me, like fingers outstretched, ready to pull me into its embrace. And then, the worst part, the flames seemed to twist and writhe, forming shapes within the fire. Faces. Shadowy figures that flickered in and out of existence. People who had died, their twisted, tormented faces staring at me. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the roar of the fire. "Please, someone help me." But no help came. The flames reached me. The heat was unbearable, as though my skin was being scorched from the inside out. I could feel my flesh beginning to melt, my lungs filling with the acrid taste of smoke, my throat tightening. The pain was indescribable, sharp, blinding. My body was being consumed, piece by piece, as the fire tore through me. In my last moments of consciousness, I thought I saw something, or someone, moving just beyond the flames, more faces, more figures, their forms blending with the fire. I could hear whispers, but they weren't words. They were voices that existed in the flames, in the smoke, in the very air around me. The ledger. The dead. The list. As my vision blurred, I realized the horrifying truth. The ledger hadn't been left for me to find. It had been waiting for me. My name had always been on the list, always meant to be on it. There was no escape. I had been marked long before I ever stepped foot into this cursed room. And now, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I heard a voice. Not in my ears, but in my very mind. "You were always meant to be on the list." Then, there was nothing. Only silence. Only the fire. It started like any other road trip, a long drive through the night, the hum of the tires on the asphalt lulling me into a daze. My car's headlights sliced through the darkness, and the soft glow of my GPS was the only thing keeping me on track. The miles stretched on without end, the loneliness of the highway pressing in on me. I had been on the road for hours, barely stopping except for fuel and snacks, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. I didn't recognize the name of the next town I passed, and when my GPS rerouted me due to a detour, I felt an unsettling nudge in my gut. The road ahead curved sharply, and a faded sign for a small roadside motel appeared on the horizon, *Hollow Creek Motel Star. I hadn't seen any signs for it along the way, and my map showed nothing in this area. It didn't matter. I was tired. I just wanted to sleep, to be off the road for a little while. I took the exit without a second thought. But something about the place felt wrong. Something in the air, in the stillness of the night, made the hairs on my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off as I pulled into the parking lot, but the dread clung to me like an unwelcome shadow. It was only a roadside stop, after all. What could go wrong? I parked in front of the lobby, which looked more like a shack, and grabbed my bag before stumbling into the dimly lit reception area. A woman sat behind the counter, her face obscured by shadow. She didn't speak, just handed me a room key, her hand cold and clammy when I touched it. I muttered a thanks and dragged my feet down the hallway, the building eerily silent. The air felt thick with something I couldn't quite place, a heaviness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I collapsed onto the bed, my body sinking into the warm sheets, and within moments, I was asleep. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke, something felt wrong. My body ached, as though I had been battered in my sleep. Bruises marred my skin, deep purple, angry red, as if I'd been thrown around. I quickly checked the clock. It was morning, or at least I thought it was. The room seemed exactly the same, and the faint light that seeped in through the curtains felt unnatural. I rushed to the window, but there was no sign of the motel. In its place, there was just the road, a stretch of cracked pavement, leading nowhere. I glanced down at the key in my hand. The numbers on it matched the room, but it seemed wrong. I shook off the dread crawling up my spine and headed outside. My car was still there, parked under a dim street lamp, and without thinking, I slid into the driver's seat. I needed to leave. But when I started the car and drove down the road, it felt like déjà vu. The same trees, the same broken road signs. The same twisted, crooked path I had been on the night before. I kept driving, hoping I had made a mistake, but when I reached the same turn, Hollow Creek Motel, there it was again. Exactly as it had been the night before, standing in isolation at the side of the road. My pulse quickened. How was this possible? How could the same thing be happening again? I parked in front of the motel, my hands trembling. My body felt strange, almost as if something had shifted within me. The same woman was behind the counter, and the same coldness radiated from her as she handed me another room key. I had no choice but to take it. Exhausted, confused, I dragged myself to the room. The lights flickered above me, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls as I shut the door behind me. I collapsed onto the bed again, pulling the thin, threadbare blanket around me, but sleep didn't come as easily this time. My mind buzzed with questions, my body restless, but eventually, I passed out from sheer exhaustion. The next time I woke, the sensation of wrongness had deepened. My limbs felt like lead, and the bruises on my body had grown darker, more vivid, as if I had been beaten through the night. My head pounded with a dull ache. I pulled my fingers through my hair, noticing the gritty, ashy substance under my nails, as though I had been digging, scratching at something. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, dizzy, and checked the clock. The same time as the last time I had looked. The room was still the same, with its peeling wallpaper and that oppressive stillness. The fear began to creep in, gnawing at my thoughts. I rushed to the window again, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the world outside shift, just enough to make me doubt my sanity. The motel was gone again. Instead, there was just the road, stretching endlessly into the distance. I panicked. Was this some kind of twisted nightmare? Had I fallen asleep on the road and was dreaming it all? But then I saw my car outside, the headlights casting a cold, unblinking stare at the empty lot. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran to it, desperate to break free. As I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel with a tightness I hadn't known before. I tried to push my fear aside. But it wouldn't go away. The road looped again, unbelievably, impossibly, and once more, I came face to face with the same road, the same turn, the same damn motel. Hollow Creek Motel. My breath hitched in my throat. There was no escape. I parked the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. With trembling legs, I walked to the door. The woman at the counter was waiting for me, as though she had known I'd be back. She handed me another room key with a vacant, almost pitying look in her eyes. The same routine. The same nightmare. I tried to fight it, tried to leave again, but each time I left the motel, I would return to the same road. The same winding path. The same crooked trees, the same cracked signs. There was no way out. I wasn't even sure how many times it had happened, whether it was the same day, or the same moment, or something else entirely. And each time, my body grew worse. The bruises, the cuts, they didn't just appear, they accumulated, spreading across my skin like a map of suffering I couldn't remember. My fingernails were stained black with the soot that seemed to rise from the earth itself. I could feel something growing inside me, something dark, something that wanted me to stay, to become part of the place. One night, after what felt like endless repetitions, I awoke again to find her standing at the foot of my bed. Her pale face was closer this time, her mouth curling into that same cold smile. "You never leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness of the room. And that was when I realized, I wasn't supposed to. I wasn't meant to escape. I was bound to this place now, to this road that loops, forever trapped in the cycle of torment. I am nothing more than another lost soul, wandering in the endless dark, my body and mind slowly eroding with each iteration. There is no escape. And you will be next. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever find the words to explain what happened that night. How do you describe a place that defies all reason? How do you recount a terror that doesn't end when you wake up? Maybe if I start from the beginning, it'll make some kind of sense, at least to you, if not to me. I should have called for a tow truck. Maybe waited until morning. But I was too tired to think straight, too desperate to find someplace, any place, to lay my head for the night. When I saw the flickering neon sign of the roadside motel, it felt like a blessing. Rooms available, it promised in dull red letters. The clerk barely looked at me as he handed over the key to room 6. His eyes darted nervously to the side, like he was watching for something just out of view. I was too exhausted to question it. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The room was fine. Beige walls, a scratchy-looking bedspread, and an old tube TV humming in the corner. But I never made it to the bed. Instead, my eyes caught the door on the opposite wall, a narrow, wooden thing I hadn't noticed at first. It was ajar, and the dim light from the room spilled into the opening, revealing a corridor. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anything behind that wall. I should have turned around and walked out. I should have called someone. But something about that corridor drew me in. Maybe it was the faint whispering I thought I heard. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to beckon. I stepped inside. The air grew cooler, and the light from the motel room quickly faded behind me. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, lit by bare, flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Every few feet, there was another door, each identical to the last. Plain wood. Brass handles. I thought it might lead to the next room over, but when I turned the handle on the first door, it didn't budge. Neither did the second. Or the third. "Hello?" I called out, my voice small and shaky. The whispering grew louder, faint words I couldn't make out. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I walked further, my footsteps echoing against the narrow walls. A glance over my shoulder showed nothing but an empty hallway behind me, the motel room gone. Panic began to set in after I'd been walking for what felt like hours. The corridor didn't end. Every door was locked, and every step forward felt like a step deeper into something I couldn't understand. I turned back, thinking maybe I'd missed a turn or an exit. But after a few steps, I realized I wasn't moving away from the hallway, I was back at the start. I sat down for a moment, trying to collect myself. My watch was frozen at 12:03, though I knew I'd been in the corridor far longer than that. Hunger clawed at my stomach, and my throat felt dry. The whispers continued, taunting me, laughing at my confusion. I tried shouting back at them, demanding answers, but the only reply was more laughter, a hollow, echoing sound that felt like it came from within my own skull. I forced myself to move again, dragging my feet along the endless path. The flickering bulbs overhead seemed dimmer now, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. I tried each door as I passed, slamming my fists against the wood, pleading for one, just one, to open. My knuckles bled, but I barely felt the pain. At one point, I thought I heard a voice, distinct from the whispers. It called my name, soft and distant, like it was coming from far down the corridor. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. The voice didn't respond, but it came again, this time closer. It wasn't just calling my name anymore, it was sobbing, begging for help. Against every instinct, I ran toward the sound, my legs trembling with each step. The walls seemed to close in tighter as I moved, and the air grew colder, biting at my skin. Finally, I reached a door that was slightly ajar, light spilling out from the cracks. The voice was louder now, desperate. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The whispers around me screamed in protest, a cacophony of unintelligible words. I pushed the door open. Inside was a room identical to the one I'd left in the motel, down to the scratchy bedspread and humming TV. But it wasn't empty. Someone was sitting on the bed, their back to me. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure turned slowly. It was me. But not just a reflection, it was me, haggard and pale, my clothes torn, my eyes wide with terror. My doppelganger opened its mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, it raised a trembling hand and pointed behind me. I turned to look, but the door was gone. The walls of the room were gone. I was back in the corridor, only now it was darker, the shadows deeper. The air pressed down on me, suffocating. The whispers became voices. Angry. Desperate. Pleading. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The air seemed heavier now, the corridor narrower. My shoulders brushed against the walls, which pulsed and groaned as if alive. "Let me out!" I screamed, kicking at one of the doors. The wood cracked, revealing nothing. Not darkness. Not emptiness. Just nothing. I turned and ran, or tried to. My legs felt heavy, as if the floor itself was pulling at me. The corridor seemed to shift, the walls curving inward. I could barely breathe. Ahead, one of the doors creaked open. A figure stepped out, shadowed and silent. It tilted its head toward me, its face obscured by flickering light. I froze as it raised a hand and pointed. Behind me, more doors opened, and the whispering reached a deafening crescendo. Figures poured out, their footsteps echoing as they closed in from both sides. There was nowhere to go. I stumbled back against the wall, pressing myself into the narrowing space. The figures loomed closer, their faces featureless yet familiar, their whispers now clear. "Stay. You've always been here." The last thing I saw was the corridor swallowing itself, folding inwards until there was nothing left, not even me. There's something about old hotels that fascinates and unnerves me. They're more than just buildings, they're repositories of countless lives, secrets, and whispers from another time. The Ritz-Ford Hotel was no exception. Perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, it exuded an air of faded glory. I was drawn to it, curious about the grandeur it once held and the stories it might still harbor. The moment I stepped through its heavy wooden doors, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. The lobby was cavernous, its marble floors and crystal chandeliers echoing a bygone era. A faint scent of brine lingered in the air, but I dismissed it as the proximity to the ocean. I should have turned back right then, but something compelled me to stay, curiosity, or perhaps a sense of foreboding adventure. The bellhop was the first thing that struck me as odd. He appeared the moment I stepped into the marble-floored lobby, his uniform impeccable but sopping wet. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his cap, pooling around his polished shoes. I tried not to stare as he greeted me with a deep bow, his voice smooth and calm. "Welcome to the Ritz-Ford, sir. Allow me to take your bag." I handed it over hesitantly. His glove squelched against the leather, and the faint smell of salt water clung to the air. I convinced myself it was just a leak somewhere in the ancient pipes. Old buildings had quirks, right? My room was on the 7th floor, and the bellhop insisted on escorting me. The elevator groaned as it ascended, and every time I glanced at him, I noticed droplets sliding down his face and neck, soaking into his collar. Yet he seemed oblivious, standing stiffly with his hands clasped in front of him. When we reached my room, he opened the door with a bow and set my bag down inside. "Enjoy your stay," he said, his voice almost melodic. Then he turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving wet footprints in his wake. The room was beautiful, if a little dated. Velvet curtains framed the windows, and a grand four-poster bed dominated the space. But as I unpacked my things, the smell of salt water lingered. I checked the windows, thinking maybe the sea breeze had carried it in, but they were sealed shut. The carpet near the door was damp, and the smell of algae grew stronger. I chalked it up to my imagination and tried to settle in. By the time I turned off the lights, exhaustion had begun to overtake my unease. I drifted into a fitful sleep, but it didn't last. I woke suddenly, choking on the smell of rot. The room was pitch black, but I could hear something. A faint sloshing sound, like water lapping against a shore. My chest tightened as the sound grew louder, closer. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, but my hand brushed against something cold and clammy. I froze. My fingers were wet, and the realization hit me like a wave: water was rising. I swung my legs off the bed, and my feet splashed into freezing liquid. It was up to my ankles, the icy chill biting at my skin. The sloshing sound grew louder still, and then came the smell: algae, decay, salt. Panic surged through me as I stumbled toward the door, the water now reaching my knees. The doorknob was slick, almost slimy, and no matter how hard I twisted, it wouldn't budge. "Help!" I screamed, pounding on the door. The water rose to my waist, soaking my clothes and pulling at me with an unnatural force. Then I felt it, a hand, ice cold and impossibly strong, gripping my wrist. I spun around, but no one was there. Instead, the water rippled, and shadows writhed beneath its surface. Another hand clamped down on my shoulder, then another on my ankle. I thrashed wildly, but it was no use. The water was up to my chest now, and the grip of the unseen hands tightened with every movement. The bellhop's voice echoed through the room, calm and melodic, as if nothing was wrong. "Enjoy your stay," he repeated, though I couldn't see him. The words reverberated in my ears as the water climbed to my chin. My lungs burned with the effort to keep breathing, my feet no longer touching the floor. And then I saw him. He was standing just above the surface, perfectly still, his uniform pristine despite the water cascading from his body. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and empty. He raised a hand, and with a simple gesture, the unseen forces pulled me under. I don't know how long I was submerged. Time lost meaning as the dark water enveloped me. When I opened my eyes, the hotel room was gone. There was only endless, murky water and the faint sound of footsteps echoing somewhere above. Some nights, I still hear those footsteps. And when I close my eyes, I see the bellhop's cold, empty gaze, waiting for me to come back. Some roads lead to nowhere, and some nights are meant to be forgotten. But sometimes, the combination of the two takes you to places you're never meant to leave. That night, I learned that the hard way. The fight was bad, worse than usual. Words that couldn't be unsaid hung in the air as I slammed the car door and sped off into the night. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I drove aimlessly through back roads, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the empty highway. I didn't have a destination, just a desperate need to escape. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to set in. The glowing neon sign of a roadside motel appeared like a mirage in the darkness. Vacancy, it blinked in erratic pulses. I didn't think twice. All I wanted was a bed and some distance from the mess I'd left behind. The desk clerk barely looked up as I approached. "Room 13, he muttered, sliding the key across the counter without meeting my gaze. It wasn't until I turned to leave that I realized why he hadn't looked at me. He didn't have eyes. Or a mouth. Or a nose. His face was a smooth, featureless void, like a mannequin brought to life. My breath caught in my throat, but he didn't react, didn't even move as I backed away slowly. I stumbled down the dimly lit hallway, clutching the key like it was a lifeline. The other guests passed me silently, their blurred faces indistinguishable from one another. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I fumbled to unlock the door to room 13. I stepped inside and slammed the door behind me, pressing my back against it as if that would keep the faceless people out. The room was as dingy as I'd expected, peeling wallpaper, a bed that sagged in the middle, a single dim bulb casting weak light. But it was the mirror that caught my attention. It hung above the dresser, cracked and grimy, but clear enough to show my reflection. Or rather, the lack of it. Where my face should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth skin, like a blank canvas. My hands shot up to my cheeks, my nose, my lips. They were there, I could feel them, but the mirror showed nothing. Panic clawed at my chest as I touched my eyes, my ears, trying to convince myself they hadn't vanished. "This isn't real," I whispered, but the sound of my voice didn't comfort me. The mirror's reflection didn't move. It just stared back at me, blank and hollow. And then it laughed. The sound wasn't audible, it was inside my head, a silent mockery that made my skin crawl. I clawed at my face, desperate to see something, anything, in the mirror. My nails raked across my skin, drawing blood, but the reflection didn't change. It remained blank, featureless, laughing silently as I screamed. The laughter grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, my sanity. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the air thick with the smell of mildew. I turned away from the mirror, but the faceless guests were there, crowding the room, their smooth voids where faces should have been all turned toward me. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was suffocating. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me. As I sank to the floor, the faintest whispers reached my ears. They weren't coming from the guests. They were coming from within me. "Join us," the voices murmured, overlapping and intertwining until they formed a haunting chant. The air around me grew colder, my breath visible as I gasped for air. The faceless figures reached out, their hands unnaturally long and claw-like, their movements deliberate but slow, as though savoring my terror. Desperate, I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls began to warp, their surfaces rippling like water. The room itself seemed alive, a breathing, malevolent entity. I pounded on the door, screamed for help, but the motel swallowed my cries. The laughter in my head reached a deafening crescendo as the faceless guests closed in, their hands brushing against my skin with icy precision. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own reflection in the mirror, grinning with a face that wasn't mine. I had been driving for what felt like days, the endless road stretching out before me, a blur of asphalt and fatigue. The hum of the engine was the only thing keeping me awake as I chased the dim glow of distant headlights, hoping to find a place to rest for the night. I hadn't planned on stopping at a motel, but I was exhausted, physically, mentally, the kind of tired that wraps around your bones and pulls you under. And then, out of nowhere, there it was. A small, isolated motel tucked between towering trees, its lights casting an inviting glow in the distance. It seemed like a place of refuge, a safe haven on a deserted stretch of road. There were no other cars, no signs of life, but that didn't matter. It was late. I needed sleep. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and walked inside, the promise of rest in my tired eyes. The clerk behind the counter was an older man, his face creased with years of time passed and little light to reveal his features. The air in the lobby felt damp, thick with the faint scent of something stale, but the building itself looked solid, almost like a relic from another time. My shoes scraped the floor as I walked up to the counter, the sound oddly loud in the silence of the place. "I need a room," I said, my voice rough from hours of driving. He didn't speak at first, just took a long look at me before sliding a key across the counter. "Room 13, he said, the words dragging slowly from his mouth. The key felt heavy in my palm as I took it, noting the oddness of the number. Room 13. It was a strange number to assign to a room, but I didn't care. I just needed to sleep. "Thanks," I mumbled, turning and walking toward the hallway. My footsteps echoed as I passed the narrow doorways, the lights overhead flickering occasionally. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should have, as though the motel itself were growing with each step I took. I looked down at the key in my hand again. It was a simple thing, old and worn. Room 13. I couldn't shake the thought that it didn't seem to fit here. But I pressed on, the weight of exhaustion growing with each step. When I arrived at the door, I stared at the number. It didn't match the key. I had checked the paper when the clerk gave it to me, room 13, but the number on the door was different. I squinted at it, a wave of confusion washing over me. Room 13, I muttered to myself, looking down at the key once more. But the door, marked with a different number, felt wrong. The key slid into the lock with a faint click, but when I twisted it, the door refused to open. I tried again, turning the key with more force, but it stayed stubbornly shut. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a step back, trying to shake off the unease that began to creep up my spine. It was just a mistake, I told myself. A simple mix-up. I turned and walked back down the hallway to the front desk, trying to ignore the strange sensation that something wasn't right. The clerk didn't look up when I approached. He just continued to stare at the desk, his face obscured by shadows. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some kind of mistake," I said, my voice faltering slightly. "The key doesn't work. The room number doesn't match either." He barely acknowledged me, his eyes darting toward the counter, and then back down. "There's no mistake," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "No record of your reservation. No vacancies." I felt my stomach tighten, an odd cold creeping over me. This wasn't right. The confusion, the hesitation in his voice, it felt like something wasn't being said. I stared at him, trying to make sense of the words, but his face was unreadable. I insisted, of course. I showed him my reservation confirmation on my phone, but he just shrugged, his hands barely moving. He didn't look at the screen, didn't seem to care. I wanted to argue more, but something in his expression, something in the way the room felt suddenly too still, told me it was pointless. With a sense of defeat, I left the lobby. I returned to my car, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors, unsure of what I was supposed to do next. The night stretched on, my body aching for rest. I tried to sleep, but the discomfort gnawed at me, a strange sense of dread filling the space around me. I must have eventually drifted off, but it wasn't peaceful. The night had a suffocating quality to it, as if the air itself was too thick to breathe. I woke up suddenly, my eyes snapping open to the cold light of morning. The world outside looked different. My heart pounded as I blinked in confusion, disoriented. I had been parked in the middle of the woods, the ground soft beneath the tires, the trees casting long, eerie shadows over the car. Where was the motel? I turned in my seat, scanning the horizon. There was nothing but trees. The road, the motel, gone. The air felt heavy with something unspoken, and I could taste the metallic tang of fear in the back of my throat. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Nothing. My fingers trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, panic bubbling in my chest. I should have seen the road, the highway I had driven in on, the familiar stretch of asphalt, but now there was nothing. The world had changed, as if it had shifted overnight. I stepped out of the car, my feet unsteady on the damp earth. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, an oppressive silence hanging over the place. My eyes scanned the empty horizon, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something, movement, just beyond the trees. But when I looked, there was nothing. Only more forest, and more silence. The world felt wrong. The motel, the clerk, the key, all of it had dissolved into the nothingness around me. My thoughts raced, desperately trying to make sense of it, but the pieces didn't fit. The road had vanished, swallowed by the woods, and I had no idea where I was anymore. I climbed back into the car, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. The engine roared to life beneath me, but I couldn't bring myself to drive. The unease that had settled in my bones was now an icy certainty. I was trapped, but trapped in what? A place that no longer made sense. A space between worlds. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just sit and wait to be swallowed by the forest. I had to find my way back to reality, to where the road had been. I slammed the car into drive, and the tires spun, kicking up dirt as I sped off, desperate to escape. The woods seemed endless. No matter how far I drove, nothing changed. The trees were the same, the shadows never lifting. I felt as though I was moving in circles. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching unnaturally. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed me whole, trapped me within its boundaries. Then, as I rounded another curve, I saw it. The motel. But it wasn't right. The lights were dim, and the sign flickered, barely legible. There was no warmth to it, no comfort. Just a cold, oppressive presence. I parked the car, not knowing why. The instinct to get out of the car, to run, overwhelmed me. But I didn't. I opened the door and stepped out, the ground beneath me shifting. The motel, its structure, its walls, seemed to be breathing. The air around it felt alive with something dark, something that watched, waited. The door of the lobby swung open as though it had been expecting me. And in that moment, I realized that I was never meant to leave. The clerk was standing there, his face now pale and distorted, his eyes wide, gleaming with a sickening joy. His mouth opened, but no words came out, only a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the ground beneath me. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest, but my legs wouldn't obey. The door creaked behind me. The world around me twisted. Reality bent, and the ground beneath me cracked open, revealing shadows deeper than any darkness I had known. I tried to scream, but the air stole my breath. The last thing I saw before I was swallowed whole was the clerk's smile, widening into something monstrous, something inhuman. And then, there was nothing. No sound, no light. Only the endless, suffocating darkness of a room that never was. The sun had long set, and the dim glow of the headlights was the only thing that cut through the dark expanse of the highway. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, as my mind raced with anticipation. Tonight, it was supposed to be just the two of us, my mistress and I, away from the mundane, away from the pressures of my ordinary life. It had been weeks since we'd last shared one of these stolen moments, and I couldn't wait to escape into the feverish embrace of the night. "Room 13, she had said. Her voice was always a seductive purr, laced with promises of passion. The motel she'd chosen was old, dilapidated, the kind of place you only stopped at when you were desperate for a quick escape from the world. The neon sign flickered above, casting an eerie, sickly light over the cracked pavement. As I parked, the buzzing of the sign seemed to get under my skin, heightening the tension that had already started to build. I glanced at my watch. It was a little later than I'd planned. She hated it when I was late. My heart pounded a little faster, a mix of excitement and guilt twisting inside of me. I shut off the engine, stepped out into the cool night, and made my way to the door of room 13. My breath came in shallow bursts, the anticipation of what was to come making my body hum. I knocked softly at first, then louder when there was no response. There was a strange silence on the other side of the door. The kind of silence that made you wonder if the world had just stopped spinning. I knocked again, harder this time, and still, no answer. Unease curled in my stomach, but I told myself it was nothing. She was probably just waiting for me to come inside. With a sigh, I twisted the doorknob. It clicked open. The door swung inward with a soft groan, revealing the dark room. The heavy scent of stale cigarette smoke mixed with the faint tang of mildew in the air. I couldn't see much at first, but I didn't need to. The faint light from the hallway filtered in just enough for me to make out the silhouette of a figure sitting at the edge of the bed. The room felt heavy, almost oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. But it was her. I knew it had to be her. "Amelia?" I called out, stepping inside. No response. I squinted into the shadows, straining to make out her figure. There was no movement, no sound, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner in the corner. I felt a trickle of sweat down my spine. Something wasn't right. But I couldn't turn back now. I had already come too far. "Amelia?" I repeated, my voice trembling slightly. Still nothing. I couldn't explain it, but there was an overwhelming sense that I was being drawn deeper into the room, into the silence. Every step felt heavier, like my feet were sinking into the floorboards. The chill in the air seemed to intensify as I neared the bed, the oppressive weight of the room pressing down on my chest. I stopped just a few feet from the figure, and my stomach lurched. I didn't know what was wrong, but everything about this felt wrong. I should have turned around, should have run. And yet, I couldn't. The figure slowly turned its head toward me, its movement slow and deliberate. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The eyes that met mine were cold, empty black pits. For a moment, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. It was me. My own face, staring back at me, twisted into an expression of unrelenting fury. It wasn't just my face, it was me, yet somehow warped. The skin seemed stretched and cracked, the eyes hollow and dark. But most unsettling of all was the pure, unbridled rage that radiated from this thing. I felt my own breath quicken. My limbs turned to stone. I couldn't move. My heart hammered in my chest. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure growled, its voice deep and distorted, a mockery of my own. It didn't sound like me, and yet, it did. The anger, the hatred, it was all too familiar, all too real. I couldn't understand it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs were frozen, my hands trembling at my sides. I felt the panic crawl up my throat, but it was as if something was choking me, something invisible that kept me in place. The figure stood slowly, its movements stiff, unnatural. Its face contorted into a grotesque grin, the kind of smile that only a monster would wear. "You're not leaving," it hissed, its voice almost a whisper now. Before I could react, the thing lunged at me. Its speed was inhuman, faster than any person could move. In an instant, it was upon me, its hands cold and clammy, gripping me with an unnatural force. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping us inside. I was paralyzed, unable to even bring my hands up to defend myself. The creature, myself, or something that used to be me, held me with an iron grip. Its face was inches from mine, its breath rancid and foul, a sickening heat radiating from its twisted form. "You've always wanted to leave, haven't you?" it sneered, its voice dripping with venom. "You've always hated yourself." The room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the air thickening. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my lungs on fire as I struggled for air. Just let me go," I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. The creature's smile widened. "You should have never come here." Its hands tightened around my throat, and the darkness consumed everything. I could feel the last threads of my consciousness slipping away. The edges of my vision blurring into nothingness. My mind screamed for release, for escape. But there was no escape. And then, just as everything seemed to vanish, I felt it, a sharp, jagged pain in my chest, like something had pierced it, something cold and unrelenting. It was as though the darkness itself had reached into me, tearing me apart from the inside out. The thing holding me, let out a low, satisfied chuckle. "You'll never leave," it whispered in my ear. "You're me now." And as the world went dark, I realized with horror that it was true. The thing that had once been me was now my future, and I was nothing more than a twisted reflection of a man who had never truly lived. We had been driving for hours, tired and drained, the road stretching endlessly before us. The car's engine hummed steadily, but the monotony of the highway had begun to take its toll. I glanced at my partner, Anna, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. We needed to rest, but the nearest town was miles away. Just as we were about to give up and keep driving, we saw a flicker of light in the distance, an old, shabby motel perched at the side of the road, its neon sign buzzing weakly. "Rest stop," I murmured, my voice hoarse from the dryness of the air-conditioned car. We pulled into the gravel parking lot, the sound of tires crunching beneath us like the last remnants of life in a decaying world. As we approached the front desk, we noticed the manager, tall, with a shadowed face, as if he'd been up too long. His eyes locked onto ours with a strange intensity. "Room 13, he said, his voice rasping. "It's an old room, but I can give you a discount. The others are all taken tonight." We exchanged uneasy glances. A room marked with the number 13. Of course, it wasn't the best omen, but we didn't have the energy to protest. We just wanted sleep. He handed over the keys with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll find it comfortable," he assured us, his words dragging like thick syrup. "Nothing to worry about. Have a good night." Little did we know, the room would soon drag us into something much darker than either of us could have imagined. The instant we stepped into room 13, an unsettling chill filled the air. The room was sparse, outdated, with faded curtains that barely blocked the pale moonlight from filtering through. The bed seemed worn, the mattress sagging under its own weight. I felt it, the heaviness of the place. There was something about the air, thick with a sense of decay, that made my skin crawl. We quickly dismissed the unease, too tired to think much of it. I stripped off my shoes, throwing myself onto the bed. Anna followed, and for a brief moment, the sounds of the world outside, the hum of distant trucks, the rustling of wind through the trees, faded away as we both fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. It wasn't long before I woke. At first, I thought I had been dreaming. But the sound of dripping water, slow and deliberate, pulled me from my half-dreamed haze. I sat up, my heart pounding as the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. The clock on the nightstand blinked 3:14 a.m. in red, its faint light casting long, eerie shadows across the room. And then I saw it. The walls. They were bleeding. The crimson liquid oozed from the peeling wallpaper, dripping in thick, steady streams. The air tasted metallic, as if the very room had been soaked in blood for years. My throat constricted, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I reached for Anna, shaking her awake, but she didn't respond. Her body felt cold to the touch, like she was already slipping away from me. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the walls, my mind struggling to process what was happening. That's when I felt it, the weight. The bed beneath me sank with an unnatural force, as if something heavy had just crawled under the mattress. I could feel the springs groaning under the pressure, the entire bed shifting like something was crawling inside it. Panic surged through me, and I tried to scramble off, but the bed refused to release me. Muffled screams echoed from the bathroom. The sounds were distant, as if someone was trying to reach me, but they were coming from all directions at once. It was impossible to tell if they were real or just part of the madness that was closing in on me. The blood on the walls continued to drip, now pooling at the floor, as if the very foundation of the room was being consumed by some dark force. I forced myself to the edge of the bed, trying to calm my breathing. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the thickening atmosphere. Then, my gaze turned to the mirror above the vanity. A strange reflection appeared in the glass. A woman's handprint, bloody and slow, began to form, as if a spectral hand was pressed against the glass. The fingers moved with unnatural precision, dragging downward, as though they were being pulled into the mirror itself. I watched in horror as the handprint stretched, the blood smearing, dragging with it a woman's figure. Her face appeared, pale and haunting, her eyes wide with terror. Then, as if the glass was alive, she began to sink, her body slowly being drawn into the mirror as her scream was silenced by the thick, suffocating blood. I screamed, stumbling back, and my eyes darted to Anna. She hadn't moved, her face still frozen in the same expression of peaceful sleep, or perhaps it was something worse. The screams from the bathroom grew louder. It was the sound of someone being torn apart, dragged through the walls, their body breaking under an unseen force. I could feel the walls pressing in around me, squeezing the life out of me. The door wouldn't open. The handle turned in my hand, but the wood felt like it had been sealed shut by something unnatural, like the room itself was keeping me inside. I heard the floorboards creak, a slow dragging sound, as if something was crawling just beneath the surface of the room. I ran. There was no thought, no pause, just the raw instinct to survive. I bolted toward the door and threw my shoulder into it, bursting through with a force I didn't know I had. My legs felt weak beneath me, but I ran down the narrow, dim hallway of the motel, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the front desk, I expected to find the manager waiting, but there was nothing. The desk was empty. No sign of life. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting eerie shadows across the room. The motel seemed abandoned, as if it had never existed before that night. The manager, the room, everything, it was all gone. But room 13 still stood. Its door was cracked open, the faint glow of a flickering light spilling out. It called to me, as if it were waiting for the next victim, the next poor soul to wander into its grasp. I turned and ran into the night, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. The road stretched out before me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly free. I had escaped for now, but something had followed me, something that would never leave. I never found Anna again. She was gone, like she had never existed at all, swallowed up by the horrors of that room. And room 13? It remained on that lonely stretch of highway, waiting, just waiting, for someone else to enter and feel its cold embrace. And I knew one thing for sure, it wasn't the last time it would call.